Filled absolutely in my job as a chairperson. Do you want to sit in here beside me, Tommy? Just grab that mic. Saying in for a penny, in for a pound, seeing as I'm late, I might as well keep going. There's a bunch of questions that have come through, and so in the interest of having Tommy fly 18,000 kilometres for a 10-minute presentation, I think we better ask him one question at least. And Richard, the same question for you. Even though you've touched on it at the end there in terms of the markets are going to demand these changes, the purchasers, the Coles, the Woolies, etc. A number of people have asked this question of both of you. How much teeth do your targets have? If farmers don't achieve them, what happens? And I think that was probably aimed at what's the government going to do. But I mean, Richard, you touched on the commercial sector. Do you want to touch on what are the government's plans in an Australian context, and ask Tommy to do the same then from an Irish perspective?
Thanks, John. I will say government and the supply chain are quite nervous. You speak to the Fonterras of the world, you speak to the JBSs, and they say, we've set a target, but we don't want to be seen to be imposing this on farmers. We'd like to bring them along with us. Same with the banks, we'd like to bring them along with us. But the market's ruthless. That last slide I showed you, they will just buy, and we see it already happening. There are certain farmers in Victoria that have got access to the Coles carbon neutral target because they are lower emitting on an emissions intensity basis. That's how it will work.
Thanks, Richard. Tommy?
Yeah, so at the moment, the targets are set at a national level, and at a national level have been broken down to the individual sector. So for an individual farmer, there's no consequence essentially for not meeting an individual reduction target. It's looking like, if we implement those technology, we will make progress in the right direction. Whether we get to the 30% reduction or the 25% reduction by 2030 or not is a little bit unclear. At a national level, the governments will be paying fines if we don't meet our emissions targets. That's basically the big picture.
So yet to be decided, I suppose. Thanks, Tommy. Again, for both of you, and again, Richard, you touched on this, but I'll give it back to you again, is how do you define climate neutrality and net zero?
New Zealand should know that more than anyone else.
Yeah, but we're looking for an Australian perspective. A South African Australian perspective.
Forget the South African part. They don't have any plans. But no, look, the carbon neutral we understand because it's net zero by 2050 sources and sinks. Climate neutral does follow down this logic of radiator forcing that says for methane to do its share of the heavy lifting, it doesn't have to be zero. It's very controversial in that, if you want to get out of trouble, you've got to get rid of methane. But if you want to argue equity between gases in terms of stopping increasing warming, methane does not need to be zero to achieve that outcome. And that's climate neutral, not carbon neutral.
Thanks, Richard. Tom?
Yeah, I think we're probably having a similar conversation back home as well in terms of the carbon neutral. It's once removals are equal to or greater than emissions. The climate neutral is probably a little bit more circumspect at the moment as to what it actually means. But I suppose I should mention as well there's a broader environmental focus in Ireland as well. It's not just on carbon, it brings in water quality and biodiversity in particular, and a lot of the policy that's been implemented by government is probably having more of a direct impact in relation to water quality. So the Nitrates Action Plan, for example, where it's seen changes in the number of cows individual farmers can keep on an individual land area, which has really had a massive price on the land market over the last 12 months. And at the same time, we have very strong targets by an Irish, I suppose, standard for reforestation. But now that land for reforestation is competing with dairy farms and competing with tillage farms as well, where we have very strong plans for expansion in the tillage sector. So it's really driving a very kind of buoyant land market at the moment.
Interesting. This one's for you too, Tommy, and I didn't write it, but it is personal as someone spent most of his youth draining peat bogs to grow grass. What role does rewetting of peatland have in reducing emissions in Ireland?
Yeah, when you said there was a lot of questions coming in, John, I was trying to sit down there in the app trying to figure out how to delete some of those questions, but I clearly didn't figure it out. Yeah, So there's a lot of conversation back home without too much clear plans really around peatlands. So the situation really at the moment is with our inventory, the fact that we're grazing about 350,000 hectares of peat soils. They emit more carbon than our mineral soils actually sequester. So our grassland reserve in the country is a net emitter of carbon. So there is a plan. It started off, the terminology was re-wetting. It's evolved into water table management now at this stage, so not quite full re-wetting. So there are some incentives being put in place for farmers to re-wet some of that land, or to manage that water table, to raise the water table, and that will reduce the level of agricultural activity that can take place. And like yourself and many of your former neighbours in Kerry, a lot of our more productive dairy farms are on some of those peat soils, so that's meeting with resistance by those farmers, as you can imagine.
Yes, I have that conversation with my father regularly. Despite the fact a lot of the stuff we drained naturally went back to re-wetting with climate change. Hey, look, I have one more question. And I realise there's only one thing more dangerous than sitting between people and beer, and that's sitting between people and coffee. So, final question. Both of you have talked a lot about the mitigation strategies. Neither of you have touched on adaptation to climate change. Could I just get the top of your head on that, Richard? What kind of work is going on in Australia from that perspective?
Look, I'd have to be fair to say that Australia's got this notorious thing of focusing on adaptation for a period of time while one government's in, and then switching to mitigation when another government's in. And we're focused on mitigation at the moment, and adaptation is now called drought. So we've got all these drought hubs all around Australia that the previous government called drought because they didn't want to call it climate change adaptation. They will be renamed as climate adaptation hubs, and they are looking at strategies working with farmers on adaptation. I think I'd refer to the minister's comment on, if you think New Zealand's landscape is going to change on the 1.5, have a look at Australia. We have already started seeing demographic change quite substantially. We're seeing all agricultural industries moving to the coast. And you think about dairy. Dairy occupies all the high rainfall, good soils of coastal Australia. Land that is now under extreme pressure from canola, from other industries moving into their space. We're going to see big change. Under 1.5 degrees, agriculture will not look much like it does today.
Thanks, Richard. I visited one of your drought hubs in December and had to cross nearly 200 kilometres of flood inundated land to get to it. Tommy, from an Irish perspective.
Yeah, as a wet rock on the west coast of Europe, we've probably been pretty much insulated from the worst impacts thus far up until recent years. So we have been seeing, I won't use the term drought when there's an Australian on the panel with me, but we have seen levels of reduced rainfall during our summer months, which has had an impact, particularly in our dairy sector, where we have sort of very high pasture demand. In terms of the adaptation activity, it's been limited. I won't say there's been none, but it's been quite limited. In more recent times, we have seen the government putting some investment in from a research and from an application perspective into more drought-resilient swards. So that's really kind of the first step on an agricultural perspective into the adaptation space. But I just welcome the Commissioner's call from earlier that as a researcher, we need to be investing a lot more into the research into this area. So I think it'd be remiss of me as a researcher not to ask for more research money when I have a podium.
I'll send a note to your minister. Excellent. Thanks, Tommy, and thanks, Richard. Everybody, can you join with me in thanking this for a great presentation? So seeing as I opened with a karakia, to be appropriate to tikanga, I'll close with a karakia before we start morning tea. Mā te rongo me te whiwhingatanga e whakamanawa te au, ki te hari mutunga kore ko te tūmanoko, ki uhia koe me te whanau, ki ngā manakitanga o te wā. And Ascoelga, Gamani, Shiacoin, Agus Florsha de Hale, Lahas, Avarak, Gajo, Gaduga, Goxesher on Tail, on Quidis Far Ditcha, Agus de Winter Fain. And what that means, Osberla, is may peace and plenty bless your world with joy that long endures. May all life's passing seasons bring the best to you and yours. It's amazing, when I think of all the beatings the nuns gave me in primary school, it obviously worked off. I'm far more comfortable Ascoelga than I am in Te Reo. But anyway. We'd now like to welcome you to morning tea, which is in the Oceania room. I realise, Harry, my apologies, 20 minutes late. I won't add it to the invoice. But I presume we'll start 10 minutes later and for everybody to be back here at 10:55. Is that okay? Perfect. Everyone back here at 10:55 with your coffee. Thank you.